I, Purnima, welcome you to the class. And today I'm going to, children, going to do the lesson, the address. Uh, okay. And this story is written by Marga Manko. As I told you, I've already discussed some of the background of this lesson, and today once again before is doing the explanation of the lesson, I'm going to revise the lesson with you. So this story is about the human predicament that follow the pre-war and post-war period. Okay, so this is about human thinking about pre-war and about post-war period. Mrs. S, who was a Jew and was a rich lady, whereas Mrs. Darling, so two ladies are described here. First, Mrs. S is there, she was Jewish, and then Mrs. Darling was there. She was not a Jewish lady. The girl, the daughter of Mrs. S, had lost her house and her mother during the war. So now, children, Mrs. S, along with her daughter, she had to leave the city, as well as she had to leave her house and everything, all her belonging. And before leaving, she hands over all her belonging to Mrs. Darling, who was her friend. And children, Mrs. Darling was a cunning lady, but she thought, Mrs. S thought that she is a good lady, and she handed all her belongings, all her things to her. Now, children, the girl, daughter of Mrs. S, had lost her house and her mother during the war. And now she had decided to come back to take her possession from Mrs. Darling, an acquaintance whose address was given by her mother years ago. When she reached the house, the woman treated her with a very cold reception. In fact, she tried not to recognize her, and then she did not want to. She treated her with a cold reception, and she, first of all, she came from far away, and she did not let her enter in her house. She decided to go back anyway, and then she met her daughter, who let her in and told her to wait inside. When she saw all the possession in front of her, she could not connect with them and decided to leave the house. Now, I already told you, children, that when the address was given to her mother long back to her daughter, and was told that whenever you are free, you can go and collect a thing from Mrs. Darling. So after ringing the doorbell of Mrs. She reached that address, okay, and when she rang the doorbell of Mrs. Darling, who lived at number 46 Marconi Street, the protagonist was given a cold reception. She was not welcome at all by Mrs. Darling, and she took much time, maybe intentionally, to recognize her. Mrs. Darling had thought everyone in the protagonist's family was dead, and asked if anybody else had come along with her. So earlier she thought that everybody died, but when she was there, she thought if anybody had come along with her. Mrs. Darling refused to let the protagonist inside her home and told her to come back sometime later. The protagonist recognized her mother's green cardigan, which Mrs. Darling was wearing. She decided to go back to the train station and thought about her mother and how she told her about Mrs. Darling, who was an acquaintance of her. During the war, Mrs. Darling would visit their house and take their possessions with her, as she did not want them to get lost if they ever left the place. Mrs. Darling had a broad back. The protagonist decided to go to Mrs. Darling's home to get back their belongings. When she again rang the bell, Mrs. Darling answered the door. She let her in and asked her to wait in the living room. When they were crossing the passage, the protagonist noticed their Hanukkah candle stand that they had never used because it had been unmanageable. When she reached the living room, she was horrified as she saw all her mother's things that were arranged in a tasteless manner. The furniture was ugly and the room had a muggy smell, and it made her not interested to wait there, and she wanted to leave the place as quickly as possible. Mrs. Darling's daughter offered her a cup of tea, And the protagonist noticed the old tablecloth that had a burn mark on it when the girl was showing her the silver fork and spoon that actually belonged to the protagonist. She jumped up and walked out of the house. She decided not to visit the place again as it brought back memories of the past, and hence she decided to forget the address. So, children, this is all important points, and now I'm going to do the explanation. So, do you still know me? I asked. The woman looked at me searchingly. She had opened the door a chink. I came closer and stood on the step. No, I don't know you. I'm Mrs. S. daughter. Now, children, the story starts that the girl, she had reached to the address 46 Marconi Road, and children, she is at the door step of Mrs. Darling, and she's asking, do you still know me? I asked. The woman looked at me searchingly. She deliberately looked at her searchingly. She had opened the door a chink. I came closer and stood on the step. No, I don't know you. I'm Mrs. S. daughter. So she told me I'm Mrs. S. daughter. She held her hand on the door as though she wanted to prevent it opening any further. Now, children, when she heard that, she put a hand on her door as if she did not want that Mrs. S. daughter should come inside. She wanted to prevent it opening any further. Her face gave absolutely no sign of recognition, and children, she did not recognize her. She kept staring at me in silence. So she kept staring at her in silence. Perhaps I was mistaken. I thought perhaps it is not her. I had seen her only once, fleeting, and that was years ago. It was most probable that I had rung the wrong bell. The woman let go of the door and stepped on the side. She was wearing my mother's green knitted cardigan. The wooden buttons were rather pale from washing. She saw that I was looking at the cardigan and half hid herself again behind the door. But I knew now that I was right. Now, children, chink means narrow opening, fleeting means for a short time. So, children, some of the spelling. Chink means narrow opening. Okay, so chink here means narrow opening, and fleetingly means for a short time. Okay, so the protagonist asked the woman standing at the door if she still knew her. The lady had opened the door a little, and the protagonist came closer to the door and stood there. The woman responded negatively, and the protagonist still gave her introduction. She said that she is Mrs. S. daughter. The woman had held the door tightly as she did not want her to enter inside the house. She kept staring at the protagonist, though she could not recognize her. The protagonist thought maybe she had come to the wrong house. She had seen the woman only for a short time years ago. The woman who answered the door stepped aside and let go of the door. The protagonist recognized her mother's green knitted cardigan that the woman was wearing. The wooden buttons had become pale because of the washing. The woman noticed the protagonist looking at the cardigan. She hid behind the door. Now the protagonist knew she had come to the right house. Well, you knew my mother? I asked. Have you come back? Said the woman. I thought that no one had come back, only me. So she is telling, well, you knew my mother? I asked. Have you come back? Asked the woman. I thought that no one had come back, only me. A door opened and closed in the passage behind her. A musty smell emerged. I regret I cannot do anything for you. I've come here especially on the train. Now, children, she told the lady, told that she regret that she could not do anything for you. I've come here especially on the train. I wanted to talk to you for a moment. It's not convenient for me now, said the woman. I can't see you and that time now, but that woman behaved very rudely. She told, it's not convenient for me that I should talk to you now. I can't see you and that time. She nodded and cautiously closed the door as though no one inside the house should be disturbed. And she very carefully she closed the door. So children, that was a shock to Mrs. S. daughter. I stood where I was on the step. So instead of offering her a glass of water, she closed the door. Poor girl, she stood on the step only where she was standing. The curtain in front of the bay window moved. Someone stared at me and would then have asked what I wanted. Oh, nothing, the woman would have said. It was nothing. Now, children, musty means stale. Okay, so the protagonist asked the woman about her mother. The woman asked her if she had come back. She replied only to her. No one else had come with her. The woman opened the door and a passage was behind her. A stale smell occurred all over. The woman told her that she could not do anything for her. The protagonist told her that she had come from far place on the train just to talk to her. The woman told her it is not convenient to talk right now and asked her to come back later. The woman closed the door as she did not want anyone to get disturbed in the house. The protagonist was still standing on the step. She saw a curtain moving on the window bay. Someone was staring at her from inside the house. She thought it was nothing as the woman would have told her. I looked at the nameplate again. Darling, it said, in black letter on white enamel. Now, children, she once again looked at the letters. Okay, what was written on that? I looked at the nameplate again. Darling, it was written darling there in black letters on white emerald, on white enamel, and on the jam a bit higher the number 46. And children, and after that number 46 was written on the jam. As I walked slowly back to the station, I thought about my mother who had given me the address years ago. Now, children, the girl is going back. Poor girl. She felt very bad that she's coming far away, and there they did not even talk to her, not even let her inside the house. So she felt bad, and she started thinking of her mother who had given her this address years ago. It had been in the first half of the war. I was home for a few days and it struck me immediately that something or other about the rooms has changed. I missed various things. My mother was surprised. I should have noticed so quickly. Then she told me about Mrs. Darling. I had never heard of her, but apparently she was an old acquaintance of my mother, whom she hadn't seen for years. She had suddenly turned up and renewed their contact. Since then, she had come regularly. Now, children, she remembered that earlier how Mrs. Darling used to come her, though she never used to appear before, but all of a sudden she started coming to the house. Okay, so let me tell you some of the important word meaning. Enamel. Enamel means an opaque or semi-transparent substance that is a type of glass. Jamb, side post of a window, fireplace or doorway. Acquaintance means stranger or social contact, somebody whom you know. So here, children, the protagonist looked at the number which was written 46 there. Darling was written on the plate on white enamel. As she was going back to the station, she was thinking about her mother who gave her the address. It was the first half of the war. Now, children, she started remembering about her mother who is now no more. She was home for a few days and suddenly it struck to her that the room was different now. Various things were missing. Now, children, when she came to her house after some time, she thought that so many things in her rooms were missing. Her mother was surprised as she noticed the changes a little later. Now, children, when she asked her mother, she was surprised. She told her, already so many things I've given to Mrs. Starling as we have to leave the house any moment due to the war. It was that time when she told her about this woman, and children, then it was the first time she told about to her daughter, Mrs. S. She told to her daughter about Mrs. Darling for the first time. Mrs. Darling, she was an old contact of her. She told me she had a contact, she had an old contact with her, whom she hadn't seen for years. And the girl is surprised that woman, Mrs. Darling, she never used to appear to her in her home earlier. Suddenly she came to visit her, and since then they had been in regular contact. And children, suddenly she often used to visit to her house. They were in a regular contact. So, uh, children, she told her about Mrs. Darling, and she was started remembering about her mother. Okay, she started remembering that how she came to her. She used to come to her house, and afterwards she was a regular visitor of their house. Now she knew why she used to come to her mother. She used to take all the things which was there with her mother. So now I am going to read the next paragraph. Every time she lives here, she takes something home with her. So whenever she used to come to their house, she used to take something from her. Said my mother. She took all the table silver in one go, and then the antique plates that hung there. She took all the table silver in one go, and then the antique plates that hung there. Now, children, all the one by one, she used to take all the thing, and children, then she used to take the antique plate which was hung there, and that was very expensive also. She had trouble lugging those large vases. Lugging means carry a heavy object with great effort. And children, large flower vases were there. She had a lot of trouble. Okay, lugging. Lugging means carry heavy object with great effort. Carry a heavy object with great effort. Okay, so she uh, children carried a heavy object with great effort, especially when she had to carry those large flower pots, vases. She had trouble lugging those large vases, and I'm worried she got a crick in her back. Crick is cramp or spasm in muscle. And children, this girl, she used to feel that she must have crick in her back from the crockery. And children, so many crockery she used to carry that the girl used to afraid that she might suffer from cramp, crick in her back from the crockery. My mother shook her head pityingly. I would never have dared ask her. She suggested it to me herself. She even insisted she wanted to save all my nice things. Now, children, the daughter wanted to say something to her mother, but she could not say. The mother told that she would like to save all this thing for me, all this nice thing of her house for me. And she told, if we have to leave here, we shall lose everything, she says. Now she is telling, if we will leave here, we have to lose everything, and we have to run away any moment to some other city. Have you agreed with her that she should keep everything? I asked. Now the girl asked that have any agreement was there between you and her. As if that's necessary, my mother cried. Now she told me that what I think is not very necessary. It would simply be an insult to talk like that. Now she's telling it would be insult to her if I would talk to her like that. And think about the risk. She is running. Each time she goes out of our door with a full suitcase or bag. Now she's telling every time she had to carry a lot of things, either a suitcase or a bag. Okay. Now her mother told her that whenever that woman came to visit her, she took something from the house with her. table silvers, antique plates, and she had trouble over carrying the large vase. She told her that the cramp in her back came from the crockery. Her mother shook her head in sorrow. The woman kept telling the protagonist's mother that she wanted to save her precious thing. If they had to leave the place someday, they would lose everything. She asked her mother if she really wanted her to take all the things with her. Her mother replied that even if she did not, it would be an insult to ask her not to. She was going out with a risk herself, a suitcase full of items. My mother seemed to notice that I was not entirely convinced. She Now, children, the mother knew that the daughter is not liking whatever the way that woman is coming to her house, and Mrs. Darling taking her all the thing every time, carrying a full big suitcase or bag full of thing. So my mother seemed to notice that I was not entirely convinced. She looked at me reprovingly, and after that we spoke no more about it. Meanwhile, I had arrived at the station without having paid much attention to things on the way. I was walking in familiar places again for the first time since the war, but I did not want to go further than was necessary. I did not want to upset myself with the sight of streets and house full of memories from a precious time. In the train back, I saw Mrs. Darling in front of me again, as I had the first time I met her. In the train back, I saw Mrs. Darling in front of me. That means still she was thinking about Mrs. Darling, because as I had the first time I met her, it was the morning after the day my mother had told me about her. Now, children, she just remember it was morning time when her mother had told her about her. I had got up late, and coming downstairs, I saw my mother about to see someone out, a woman with a broad back. "This, my daughter," said my mother. She beckoned to me. Now, beckoned means signaled. Now, children, for the first time, the mother is remembering that how she gave introduction of Mrs. Darling to her daughter. It was morning time, and the mother, she told Mrs. Darling, this is my daughter." The woman noted and picked up the suitcase under the coat rack. She wore a brown coat and a shapeless hat. "Does she live far away?" I asked, seeing the difficulty she had going out of the house with the heavy case. "In Marconi Street," said my mother. "Number 46, remember that." Now, children, her mother told her that she lives in Marconi Street and the house number is 46. So, in this way, the mother had told the girl about the children, about this her house, where she was staying, and the address of her house. So, here, children, the mother noticed that the daughter is not convinced, and she looked at her critically. And after that day, she never talked about the incident again. She reached the station without noticing any details on the way. She passed the familiar thing after the war for the first time. She did not want to upset herself with the familiar sights of the houses and street that reminded her of all the precious time. Now, children, here precious time is referring to the time passed with her mother. Back in the time she saw Mrs. Darling in person a day after her mother told her daughter about her. She woke up late that morning, and as she was going downstairs, she saw the lady with broad back. Her mother was seeing her out. Her mother introduced the protagonist to the lady. She signaled to her, and the woman responded with a nod. She picked the suitcase under the coat rack. She was wearing a brown coat and a shapeless hat. The protagonist asked her mother if she lived far away. The mother told her the address, Marconi Street, number 46. So, in this way, the address was known to her. Now, again, the next paragraph. "I had remembered it, but I had waited a long time to go there." Now, children, after mother died and maybe she was busy, she still remembered the address, okay, but she was waiting for a suitable time to go and take the things of her mother. But I waited a long time to go there. Initially, after the liberation, I was absolutely not interested in all that stored stuff, and naturally, I was also rather afraid of it. Afraid of being confronted with things that had belonged to a connection that no longer existed. Now, children, in fact, actually, she did not want to collect to the children those things which was the belonging of her mother, because she was afraid of few things. Okay, she did not and wanted to remember her mother, who now no more existed, and that belonging had a connection of her mother, which she is no more in this world. So whenever she will see those things, she will remember her mother. And which were hidden away in cupboards and boxes and waiting in vain until they were put back in their place again, which had endured all those years because they were things. But gradually everything became more normal again. Bread was getting to be a lighter color. There was a bed you could sleep in unthreatened, a room with a view you were more used to glancing at each day. And one day I noticed I was curious about all the possession that must still be at that address. I wanted to see them, touch, remember. Now, children, so one day that girl, she was curious to have all her possession, and she wanted to touch those things which was belonging to her mother. Okay, and that address she still remember, and she wanted to touch those things, she wanted to remember those things. After my first visit in vain to Mrs. Darling house, I decided to try a second time. So children, her first visit was vain, it was useless, and she decided to go to Mrs. Darling house for the second time. Now a girl of about 15 opened the door to me. I asked her if her mother was at home. No, she said, my mother's doing an errand. No matter, I said, I will wait for her. So children, she remembered the address, but she took too long to visit the place. After the freedom, she was on one hand not interested, and on the other was afraid. She was afraid of getting confronted with the past memories and connection that no longer existed. Connection were hidden in cupboards and boxes. It seemed that those memories were waiting in vain to put them back to their places, as they had suffered all these years because they were only things. Things were getting normal in the protagonist's life, but one day she got curious about all the things that were still at that address. She wanted to see them and touch them. After the first hopeless visit, she decided to try one more time. Okay. So when she reached Mrs. Darling's home, a girl of 15 years opened the door. She was Mrs. Darling's daughter. Okay, protagonist asked her about her mother. She told her that she was outside doing some errands, to which the protagonist decided that she would wait for her. Okay, so now children, you can see that the mother is no more and her daughter is there, but she was at least a good, better than her mother, because she called the protagonist inside her house. I followed the girl along the passage. An old-fashioned iron Hanukkah one candle holder hung next to a mirror. As soon as she entered the passage, she saw her Hanukkah one candle holder hung next to a mirror. We never used it because it was much more cumbersome than a single candlestick. Now she told us we never use it because it is more cumbersome. Okay, a cumbersome means, it's a strange word, isn't it? The meaning of cumbersome is unmanageable. Unmanageable. Then a single candle stand. Won't you sit down? Asked the girl. She had opened the door of the living room and I went inside past her. I stopped, horrified. I was in a room I knew and did not know. I found myself in the midst of things I did want to see again, but which oppressed me in the strange atmosphere, or because of the tasteless way everything was arranged. Now, children, when she went in the room, in a very bad manner, everything was arranged. because of the ugly furniture or the muggy smell that hung there. Muggy is something humid. Okay, so some muggy smell was coming, and the furniture was not very good. Okay, and but I scarcely dared to look around me. The girl moved a chair. I sat down and stared at the woolen woolen tablecloth. I rubbed it. My fingers grew warm from rubbing. I followed the line of the pattern. Somewhere on the edge there should be a burn mark that had never been repaired. Naturally, when she saw a table cloth, she remembered that was the belonging of her mother, and she, children, with the help of the finger, she wanted to confirm whether it was hers, theirs only or not, because there was a burn mark and it was already there. When she was touching those burn marks, the girl told, my mother will be back soon. I've already made tea for you. Will you have a cup? Thank you. Okay, so with this, children, I end my video here as the time is over, and in my next video we will be discussing a lot other things of this chapter. So with this, children, I conclude my video here, and many other things. Now the interesting part, children, we are here, the girl, her daughter had entertained in her house, and let's see what is the feeling of Mrs. S daughter, what she do now. So now I'm going to conclude the chapter as the time is over now, and